Hello and welcome to the Great Wall Museum in Meaux in the east of Paris. Today we want to present you, to talk to you about the Anzac Day. We are the 25th of April, so we think it's a good idea to talk about that. Of course, if you're Australian or New Zealander, you already know that date, but for the biggest part of our audience, it's an unknown date, because in France we know well the Western Front. Of course, we know well the participation of the French and British armies to the war, but clearly less the participation of the Australian and New Zealander army. That's why that day exists. The Anzac means Australian and New Zealander Army Corps. And that date of 25th of April was chosen because that's the exact day of the landing in the Dardanelles in 1915. It's a really important date in that part of the world, and so we're going to explain why today. We're in a museum, so I think the best way to explain to you what was the Anzac forces is to show items. And to begin, I would to show you that one. That one is an Australian one, and it's pretty easy to recognize them because they have that hat, the famous slouch hat. And it's easy to recognize it because it's the only one with a brim which is a lift up on the side, and on that side, on the brim, you can see a badge, the famous Rising Sun badge. That's the symbol of Australia with the hat, and that symbol we don't really know precisely from where it came. Generally, we think that that symbol came from an officer, because Australian forces participated to the Boers War in South Africa at the end of the 19th century, and they didn't have any symbol. So their new officer decided to create one, and he was inspired by a gift he received during the war. That gift was composed with several bayonets in semicircle around a central crown, and inspired by that gift, he decided to represent it in the shape of a sun around the imperial crown of the British Empire. At the time, some people made joke about that symbol, saying that it was inspired not by some military gift, but by a logo of a brand, of a famous brand of jams and sauces. Of course, we don't have any proof of it. If you ask why the side of the hat is turned up, it's because it allows the rifle to be held without damaging the hat himself. That's why it has that famous shape that is quite specific to the Australian soldiers. Australian soldiers also wore the famous web patterns of 1908, the patterns which came from the British Army, actually. It was really light, and it allows to not injure the shoulders of the soldier when they brought with them heavy gears and heavy equipment, mostly on their back. Next to the Australian soldier, we have the New Zealander soldier, and is also recognizable with his hat, a famous one too, that one, the campaign hat, nicknamed Lemon Squeezer. Why? You can see why. It's clearly obvious, because the indentation is clearly marked on that hat. You can find that kind of hat in other armies all over the world, for example, in the US Army, but it didn't have that kind of specific shape. Okay, New Zealanders had a specificity at the time. They had Maori soldiers among their ranks. Around 3,000 Maori soldiers participated to the war, and half of them died on the battlefield. The soldiers of both countries have a lot in common. First, their nickname, diggers. It certainly came from the miners of the countries, and it has another meaning, actually. It's an egalitarian meaning. It can be summarized with the word mateship. That means that all the soldiers share the same war, share the same difficulties, and live the same thing, actually. Doesn't matter who they are, so they have actually a lot in common. And to be more specific, it also implies a lot of qualities of the soldiers. They are tough, they are resourceful, and they are used to live outdoor. A lot of them are miners or farmers, so they are particularly tough on the battlefield. And even if those two countries are relatively young at the time, and it doesn't matter, because what they lack of experience, they compensate with a great skill in the battlefield. Okay, so they were recognized as such even by more experienced soldiers and from other armies. Both soldiers were also great riders. That can be surprising for Australian or New Zealand soldiers, but in fact, both Australia and New Zealand have huge areas of wilderness in which we can find huge herds of cows and sheep, and farmers were used to use horses to lead those herds. That's why a big part of the troops in the Anzac forces were riders. Secondly, the other thing in common they have was their first great involvement in the war, and actually in wars generally, because it was their first involvement in a great international event like was the First World War. And that battle was the Battle of Gallipoli in Turkey in 1915. Okay? And to these days, it's still remembered as the beginning of the idea of a true nation in both New Zealand and Australia, which send their troops as true nations and not only part of the British Empire. So, why the Dardanelles? What we call also the Battle of Gallipoli existed because at the end of 1914, the Ottoman Empire decided to choose the German side in the war. And the problem was Russia needed a passage through the Marmara Sea, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And to do so, they decided to create that passage through an existing one, the Dardanelles, at the entrance of the sea. And it was clearly a really bad idea to do so. It was condemned to fail way before the beginning of the battle. I'm going to explain why. First, at the beginning of 1915, they tried to force the passage with ships. But they clearly underestimated the defenses of the Turks. As you can see on the map, the Dardanelles is a channel. It's Detroit. And the Ottomans knew it quite well, of course. It was their home. So they used the water current to send submarine mines at the entrance of the Dardanelles, where the Allies thought the mines were fixed. And the Turks have hidden holes just under the sea, at the base of the two mountain ranges, as you can see on the map, with torpedoes in them. It was a catastrophe for the Allied ships. No problem. They decided to try a landing. And that landing was decided on the 25th of April. But it was poorly prepared and troops were ill-equipped. Even if the Allies succeeded to establish a small air bridge, it was at great cost, including for Anzacs, and for no real avail. So they tried several times. The last attempt was in August 1915, precisely the 6th. At that moment, the Anzac legend started, because the Anzac forces were sent in a small part of the Dardanelles called Saribaya, while the main forces of the Allies attacked further north in Suvla Bay. The goal was a little beach, not more than 200 yards wide, not much. And the problem was, it was strongly built with strong trenches. So at the end, it was merely an end-to-end fighting between the Turks and the Australian forces, mainly. Okay? But at the end of the day, it was a victory for the Australian forces, who won the Lone Pine site, as it was called. Another example of immense bravery was the charge of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade of the Australian Army. And they attacked a place called Russell's Stop at the north of Lone Pine. And they attacked against a place of immense strength, heavily defended with clearly insufficient numbers of soldiers. Wave after wave, they attacked again and again and again. They obeyed to orders. And even if it was a massacre, they continued until they finally received the order to stop the attacks. In 15 minutes, they lost 3/4 of their men on 600 men in total at the beginning of the battle. In the meantime, New Zealanders tried to win the summit near Lone Pine, and that summit was called Hill Q. And after violent battle and violent fightings, they finally won that summit. But the problem was the summit was clearly too exposed to cannon shots, so they lost approximately 75% of their troops, as their Australian comrades did, and nonetheless they hung on the top of a hill until they were relieved by British forces. Finally, after 9 months of battle, the Allies decided wisely that the Battle of Gallipoli was a disaster, and so they ordered the withdrawal of the troops. After 9 months of battle, on 500,000 soldiers sent in Turkey, half became casualties. Among them, more than 7 7,000 Austrian soldiers died and more than 2,000 New Zealand soldiers died in that battle. And even if it was clearly defeat for the Allied forces, it was considered as the first act of extreme bravery and foundation act for both Austrian and New Zealand soldiers in Australia and New Zealand as nations. After the Battle of Gallipoli, Anzac forces were sent in both completely different battlefields. The Light Horses Brigade were sent in Palestine, for example, where the fightings in the desert, in wide areas of the desert, still allowed fightings on horseback. They were clearly more useful and they were clearly more efficient too in the desert. On the contrary, the infantry was sent on the Western Front in France. For them, it was the beginning of a complete different war. A part of Anzac forces were sent on the Western Front. Of course, like the biggest part of the British Expeditionary Force, they fought during the Battle of Somme. They fought in the worst battlefields during the war in that part of the Western Front, and a lot of them showed example of great bravery as they did in all the war. But there was specifically a battle really famous, notably in Australia, and because of the general who led the battle on the Australian side. And I want to talk about Sir John Monash. In 1918, the German army launched a huge attack called the Spring Offensive. Their goal was clearly to win definitively the war. They knew at the time that they didn't have the means to continue the war again and again. So they knew they had to stop it right now. Of course, by winning the war. And at that time, they almost succeeded. There was, at a moment, the German army was at almost 80 kilometers from Paris. But in July 1918, things changed. The tides turned against the German army. And one of the important events in the defeat of the German army was in July near the little town of Hamel in the Somme. In terms of forces implied in that battle, it was not the most impressive battle, but actually the secret of the battle was the decision of Sir John Monash, the general of the Australian army, to use at the same time soldiers, cannons, but also airplanes and tanks at the same time on the battlefield. In 93 minutes, the battle was over and won by the Australian forces. After that battle was an example of efficiency on the battlefield. Okay? Even if Sir John Monash planned to win in only 90 minutes. Yeah, it was 3 minutes too late, but it was quite good, I think. Okay, and so after that moment, the Allied forces could counterattack really efficiently, and the German army was obliged to withdraw again and again until they reached November of 1918, and they asked for the armistice. That little guided tour ends here. I hope you enjoyed it. And now it's time for you to meet the director of Sir John Monash Centre near Villers-Bretonneux, a little town in the Somme, quite famous in Australia, and to discover at the same time the centre and the military cemetery and the memorial, the Australian National Memorial, which is also in Villers-Bretonneux. I hope again that you enjoyed that visit, and of course you can leave commentaries on the website and in the social networks. Don't hesitate. We ask if you have any question, and we'll answer, of course. Thank you again, and see you soon.
The 25th of April is Anzac Day, a day that has its origins in the landings of Australian and New Zealand soldiers in Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. The word Anzac is an acronym for these troops and stands for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. The acronym has evolved and has become a well-known word of the Australian vernacular. The Anzac Spirit captures the characteristics of these soldiers who landed in Gallipoli. The courage, sacrifice and mateship they demonstrated on that fateful day as they landed on the beach under fire has shaped the narrative of the enduring Anzac spirit. Today, Anzac Day is a day to acknowledge all veterans, where Australians recognise the more than 1.5 million servicemen and women who have served in all conflicts, wars and peacekeeping efforts. I think you only need to look at the expressions of remembrance that exist today to get an insight into how Australians feel about the First World War. The phrase so well known, "lest we forget," is always said to remember the service and sacrifice. The Ode of Remembrance has been recited at commemorative services since the 1920s, and the phrase it concludes on, that is repeated by the audience, is "we will remember them." Australians are committed to ensuring the sacrifice of their ancestors is not forgotten. Last year, with the dawning of the pandemic in the months prior to Anzac Day, commemorative services globally were cancelled. At this time, in Australia, beautiful community-led initiatives emerged, with individuals and groups demonstrating their commitment to marking the day and guiding their own commemorations. Street after street in Australia, residents stood outside their houses at dawn with candles to light the start of the day. Never before has there been more social media and online commemorations marking Anzac Day and echoing the expressions of remembrance that were coined in the period immediately following the First World War. To me, this shows the strong commemorative spirit that exists in Australia. I'm the director of the Sir John Monash Centre in Villers-Bretonneux in the Somme. One of my favourite quotes is that from Sir John Monash himself, where he states, "There is no spot on the whole of this tortured soil of France that is more associated with Australian history and the triumph of Australian soldiers than Villers-Bretonneux." In a twist of fate, in 1918, the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, which saw the swift recapture of the town by the Allied troops, took place on the 25th of April, the third anniversary of the Gallipoli landings and what we now know as Anzac Day. The day before, the 24th of April, the Germans had succeeded in capturing the town of Villers-Bretonneux as part of their advance towards Amiens, an extremely important logistics hub. Capturing Amiens would mean effectively cutting off the Allies' resupply chain and would afford the Germans an easy route to Paris. To ensure the Germans did not have the chance to entrench themselves in their defensive positions, an Allied counterattack was quickly issued. The Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux is described as a crucial turning point in the war. Australian and British troops launched the counterattack at night on the 24th of April, and by the 25th of April had cleared the town of all enemy troops. But it was also a ferocious battle, and the many of the Allied troops who fell on the 25th of April have their final resting place at the Villa Bretonneux Military Cemetery. The Sir John Monash Centre is nestled in behind the Australian National Memorial, a memorial to the missing with almost 11,000 names of Australian soldiers forever etched in stone with no known grave. The memorial is built at the Villa Bretonneux Military Cemetery, the final resting place for over 2,100 soldiers of the Commonwealth. The Sir John Monash Centre is an immersive experience. It's an interpretive centre that uses cutting-edge multimedia technology to tell the story of Australia's experience on the Western Front during the First World War in the words of those who served. To enable us to tell these stories, our historical researchers and development team use letters and diaries of soldiers to create the content that's shown at the centre. The centre also has an extensive collection of original film footage and is able to bring these stories to life by interweaving the words, the film footage and the images with dramatic recreations, taking the visitor on a journey and sharing the emotions of the experiences of the soldiers. The location of the Sir John Monash Centre is significant. It's built on the land where so many fought and fell. By sharing their story, in their words, on this very piece of land, provides the most fitting commemoration to these soldiers.